Hello, my name is Tej van Pettinger of Economics Help, and today I'd like to talk about the economic costs of war. Firstly, the real cost of war is human suffering, human tragedy, but today we're going to look at it from the economic perspective. Firstly, you've got all the loss of buildings, infrastructure that need to be rebuilt. You've got the loss of human life, which is less productive capacity. You've got cost of munitions, cost of sanctions, loss of trade, loss of confidence. Now, one interesting thing is that as humanity has evolved and we've become more industrialized, war has become increasingly expensive. What I mean by this is if we go back to the Viking Age, a war could have a strong economic benefit. It was very cheap to run the Viking army. You just took your sword along, lift off the land, you went to other countries and you could steal loot and gold and take it back. So war was often profitable. You could argue there was an economic incentive to engage in war. And even up to the Middle Ages, the early era of colonial expansion, war and conquest could be seen as a way to improve your wealth. And this is very much what we call a mercantilist approach. There was a dominant economic theory up until the 19th century. The idea that if you wanted to increase your wealth, you needed more gold, you needed more silver, increase your land and resources. And to do that, often colonial countries resorted to conflict, war, but they could enrich themselves by doing that. However, industrialization and the growth of trade between nations started to change this balance. By the 20th century, trade is much greater between countries. And also, it's much more expensive to run armies because they need food, they need munitions, more equipment involved, increasingly technological. So the cost of war is higher, the damage to areas much greater, and also wars did very little to increase the natural resources that used to happen in, say, the Middle Ages. And when we get to today's situation, 2022, war is increasingly costly for more reasons. Firstly, the world is very integrated through globalization. And a very good example of this is what will happen to the Russian economy with far-reaching sanctions. So Russia had built up very strong, high levels of foreign currency reserves, about $630 billion. So Putin probably felt he had a lot of resources to fund the war. But these foreign reserves relied on being able to access dollars from other central banks. So when sanctions were introduced, most of these foreign currency reserves have been frozen and Russia can't access them, which is a big problem for the Russian economy. Also, sanctions will affect trade and manufacturing. Now, it is true that, for example, Russia has developed its own factories where it produces tanks and aeroplanes. But the big difference between now and, say, Second World War is that a lot of manufacturing plants rely a lot on the import of raw materials, but more importantly, half-finished product. So in the early days of building an airplane, a company would build the whole airplane from scratch. But in the modern world, that doesn't happen because here in Oxford, there's a car factory, BMW Mini. But what they do is they import engines from Germany. They import tires from somewhere else. They import all these components. So if there were sanctions imposed on the UK, we couldn't produce any cars, even though we have a car factory, because they wouldn't be able to get the components. So Russia is likely to face a very similar scenario. But although it has factories producing planes and tanks and cars, but if world trade is cut off because of sanctions, it will find it very hard to get components. And also, Russia is very much dependent upon exporting goods and services. Obviously, oil and natural gas are important. And if these are squeezed, then its ability to earn foreign currency will be vastly reduced. Also, in the old days, go back to the Middle Ages, if you invaded a country and you gained its land and resources, that would usually enrich you. But modern warfare is very different. Um, Firstly, there's likely to be a lot more nationalistic resistance than in the era before nationalism was important. And the costs of conflict in cities and is very devastating. And so the Russian economy is likely to be very severely impacted by their invasion of Ukraine and the response of the Western world in terms of placing sanctions on them. The ruble has fallen dramatically. And if you look at this graph, you can see how each invasion and each round of sanctions caused the ruble to fall. And the ruble is only going to get weaker and weaker because who would want to own rubles when it's very difficult to convert it into something else? And this will mean higher prices for consumers in Russia, and it will mean lower living standards.